extractive and inclusive institutions, was that original to Why Nations Fail, or was that an idea that you had teased out in papers before the book was published?
So I think it partly, you know, the notion of extractive institutions we sort of developed in one of our early papers, this paper on colonial origins, which was, I think that's our most successful academic paper in terms of citations. But actually we didn't have terminology for the opposite of extractive. It was sort of degrees of extractive. But in some sense,
Sure.
to write the book, we realized that we needed a word for the opposite thing of extractive, and actually it was a very good friend of ours, Tim Besley, who's a professor, very distinguished, actually Sir Tim Besley, who's a very
how about that?
distinguished economist at the London School of Economics. We were at a conference in Buenos Aires, and we went to have lunch in the Plaza de San Telmo, if you know Buenos Aires at all. And
No,
Tim, we said, like, Tim, come on, and Tim came up with this idea of this word inclusive, and we immediately realized that that's the perfect word for what we're talking about. It's completely the opposite of extractive institutions. And so that was, I mean, we tried to come up with, the thing about the world is complicated, and all the details are so different, So if you want to compare, North Korea and Sierra Leone and Colombia, all the details are different. And you need a sort of language that allows you to see, despite all those differences of the details, these places all have something in common. What is it? And so that I think that terminology was very important. That seemed to resonate with people. And but yeah, it was Tim Besley who came up with inclusive. I claim no credit.
And you said the difference between North Korea, Ecuador, and another country, and how try explanations beforehand to try and explain why they might have been developing whilst other nations were developed. But what the book does initially is it sort of expels the three sort of classic explanations for why a nation failed. The geographical hypothesis, the cultural hypothesis, and the ignorance hypothesis. And I really loved reading about that because I was quite, I mean, I still don't know much about it at all, but I was ignorant to these ideas, right? Because it is easy for one to try and sort of explain, well, Africa is always going to be stifled and poor because look at their geography. You can't transport down the river system. They don't have natural harbors. It's got no roads. And you could make this geographical explanation. I wanted to ask you if you could lay out the argument for why the extractive inclusive matrix way of looking at things to evaluate a country is better opposed to those three classical hypotheses. If you could disprove the three hypotheses and then prove extractive inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I think scientifically disproving them, it takes data and data analysis, and that's what a lot of our papers did, early scientific papers. Of course, that's not the book tries to use simpler ways of thinking about that. It tries to use what we call natural experiments, like take the Korea, the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula is, sort of has 1,000 years of centralized state authority, common language and culture and history, and and then it gets arbitrarily split in half at the end of the Second World War, and the North gets a sort of communism slapped on top of it, and the South, gets this capitalist market economy. Okay, the book is not about communism and capitalism; it's about extractive and inclusive institutions. But the point there is that it's almost like a sort of experiment, where you create these very different. You take a place which is very culturally and geographically homogeneous, and you create these very different institutions with very different incentives, and you get this massive economic divergence. So that can't be explained by geography or culture. It's got to be explained by the fact that these institutions create very different patterns of incentives and opportunities. So we use examples like that. We lead with this example of Nogales. Nogales is sort of split down the middle with a fence, and half of it is in Mexico and half of it is in the United States. And again, that's it's a very culturally, geographically homogeneous place. but there's enormous economic divergence because part of it is under the institutions of the United States, and the other part is under the institutions of Mexico. So that's, we use that to kind of rule out these other hypotheses. In the book, that's sort of the approach we take, because that just seems much more intuitive, and we want to stay out of data and things like that.
Yeah, it is much more intuitive. Like anyone who can look on a map or knows about the North Korean anecdote or has traveled to Mexico or America, that, like, it's very easy to conceptualize that straight away. It's like, obviously the geographical argument doesn't work here, and obviously the cultural argument doesn't work here, and more mathematics, neither does the ignorance hypothesis. But I just wonder, like, in those specific areas, you can create your sort of specific explanation for why that's the exception there. I'm asking you to do a difficult thing, obviously, which is to sort of explain globally why those three hypotheses just don't work. Because if you take the Nogales US example, you can explain your way out of it. Same with the North Korea, South Korea.
I think there's lots of different ways of seeing that. One thing we pointed out in one of our scientific papers is, there's this supposed fact that tropical countries are poorer than temperate latitudes. But if you think about, just take the Americas and think about the history of the Americas, and you go far enough back in time, let's say go back 500 years, actually the opposite was true. Where was the political and economic development in the Americas at the time of colonialism? Not in North America and Canada, Central America, the Mexicas, or the Mayas were sort of in decline by that time. Or the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was an incredible thing. They built tens of thousands of miles of road. They had a famine relief system, granaries, they produced public goods. I mean, it was an
famine relief system.
Yeah, yes, they had this incredibly organized society, the Incas. What was there in North America? Nothing. There was nothing. So if anything, if you think about development, it was the tropical places that were more affluent than the what about the South, Latin Argentina or Chile? There was nothing there, compared to Andy. So that was an enormous reversal. Actually, there was a huge reversal, and this pattern within the Americas of the temperate zones are more prosperous is actually a consequence of colonialism. It's not something intrinsic to kind of geography or anything like that. It was a consequence of institutional creation during the colonial period. So I think there's many. That's an example, in some sense, where you see that there can't be any persistent kind of constant relationship between geography and prosperity. It's all to do with what sort of societies humans create, essentially. And I think the same is true in Africa. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence showing that these claims about African prosperity being a consequence of geography are just completely incorrect. And I've always found it wildly implausible, personally. Just never coincided with any intuition or idea I had it being in Africa, and Africans are just So I could give other pieces of evidence, but that's the sort of strategy we take. We just try to take these historical experiments and just try to show that really challenges these ideas about the relationship between geography and culture. The Korean thing is an interesting example of culture. I think with culture it depends. Cultures are different. Cultures are different in the world, But I guess, we'd say, think about the China, we could discuss cultural differences but my impression is that doesn't really get in the way of, people value their cultures and they love their cultures and they're attached to their cultures. But people, in my experience, they all aspire to all the stuff that, you and I have, access to education, security, healthcare, like traveling, jobs, all sorts of things. They don't want a government that exploits them and suppresses them or represses them. They want freedoms and political freedoms and economic freedoms. And, in my experience of working in different parts of the world, people have very similar aspirations like that. And so that's the kind of presupposition of the work, but they can't enjoy those things because they're living under these extractive institutions in so much of the world.
Yeah, the differences between cultures are usually just the details, right? But the macro view is kind of universal. And then just to re-say what you said there, but off the back of that, can you define, because what inclusive extractive does very well is it almost gives a global explanation, which you can then locally apply, right? So off the back of that, could you define for us what is an inclusive economy, both politically and economically, and then extractive, please?
Yeah, I think the thing to bear in mind before getting to the definition is, what is it that creates prosperity? We're trying to explain why is it that some parts of the world are more prosperous than others. And economists have known, and I think they got this right since the work of Robert Solow, actually the great MIT economist Robert Solow in the 1950s, that it's innovation. It's innovation, it's creativity, it's new ideas, it's entrepreneurship. That's what creates prosperity. That's what increases productivity of human labor. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, that really, created the world we see today, created all the inequalities we see in the world. That's all about innovation, about mechanization of production, the steam engine, the railway, the factory system. So to be prosperous, a country has to just it has to find a way of tapping into all that latent talent and energy and ambition and, like the visions and dreams, or the things that makes human society so kind of interesting and fun, right? The kind of nuttiness and originality of humans. And so, but where is that? Where is that talent? Where are those people? You don't know where they are. You need so the word inclusion, I'm sort of saying this because the word inclusion turns out to be very significant, even though we didn't come up with it, which is that, you need a system of rules, of institutions that creates very broad-based incentives and opportunities. So you can tap into all that latent talent in society. Like the thing you see like in a place like Congo is just so much wasted talent, so many clever people, so many, who just have no opportunities. There's no road, there's no school, there's no there's just no way out, and so inclusive institutions are, institutions that create broad-based incentives and opportunities. And extractive are the opposite. Extractive institutions, put barriers to opportunity, and they create incentives for some people and not for other people, and that creates wealth for some people, but it creates poverty for the mass of people.
Can you define them both through like a country profile? What is sort of an archetypally extractive economy and politic, so we can then understand the definition much better through example, and then the same for inclusive?
So I like a lot, the example, the first chapter of the book where we tell the story of the history of economic divergence between North America and Latin America. We end the chapter with an example that I like very much, which is not two countries, but two people, which is Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, who at the time we read,
that's a great one.
Richest men in the world. I mean, they're still in the ballpark. I think Jeff Bezos may have overtaken them or whatever, So
they're still bloody rich.
So they're very rich. But, what's important here is not how rich they are, but how they made their money, So Carlos Slim made his money through getting his friends in the one-party state to privatize the telecom monopoly to himself. Bill Gates made his money through innovation. He made his money through Microsoft, the operating system,
and to create new value.
Exactly. And why was he doing that? Did Bill Gates not think about being a monopolist like Carlos Slim? Of course he did. Microsoft was found guilty of violating the Sherman Act for monopolistic practices. They're all at it. Apple, Facebook, all of them. Everybody wants to be a monopolist. They're all at it. It's just more difficult to get away with it in the United States. Why is it more difficult to get away with it? Because of the institutions, because of things like the Sherman Act, because the state can enforce the Sherman Act on the richest guy in the world. That's unthinkable in Mexico. Absolutely unthinkable in any Latin.
And the reason it's unthinkable is because of sort of the political corruption, right? And
Yeah,
like ultimately, that's
because
the
the state
biggest.
is captured by these people, because because there's dictatorship, and because there's the massive failure of accountability, because there's no public pressure on the state to enforce rules on these people.
Mhm.
So I think that example drives home brilliantly, like how the institutions matter, and how this is not about culture. It's not about like Hispanic culture bad, Anglo-Saxon American culture.
Yeah,
No, no, no. Gates would have been just like that, except he was in a different
sure.
institutional
Yeah,
environment.
the political institution then backed up by the economic institutions that then creates the prosperity.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, our view is we're sort of political determinists. Like for us, the politics is the economics is incredibly important for creating economic incentives, but ultimately, it's the politics that creates different economic institutions. It's really
yeah,
that's the key. So for us, you could say, well, in some general way, don't politics and economics interact? And I could say yes, actually, but all the research, all the academic, all the scientific research we've done suggests that it's the politics that really drives things. So in Why Nations Fail, it's really, yes, you need to have inclusive economic institutions, but if you
hmm
want to have inclusive economic institutions, you better have inclusive political institutions. That's why we think this whole Chinese growth experience is not sustainable, because China was able to grow by making economic institutions more inclusive. That's a
hmm
good anti-cultural story too. It's not that
yeah.
Chinese culture changed and suddenly China became more wealthy. No, it's they got rid of many elements of extractive
They
economic.
change your institutions.
Yeah, they started creating
Yeah,
incentives and opportunities, and people responded. But the political system never changed. And what we say in the book about that is that you can't have an inclusive economy in a sustainable way with extractive political institutions. It's a train wreck. What history suggests is that's a train wreck waiting to happen. Which is a
yeah.
scary thought for the world, but that's
Um,
that's the prediction.